There are 5 exit doors on our 727, 2 on each side of the airplane, each equipped with a slide which is placed automatically, and 1 centered in the back of the airplane equipped with stairs. There are also 4 window exits located over the wings. Look around now and locate the 2 exits nearest your seat. In the event of an evacuation...
The stewardess serves a meal and passes out magazines. What kind of war is it that begins and ends that way, with a pretty girl, cushioned seats, and magazines? You add things up. You lost a friend to the war, and you gained a friend. You compromised one principle and fulfilled another. You learned, as old men tell it in front of the courthouse, that war is not all bad. It may not make a man of you, but it teaches you that manhood is not something to scoff. Some stories of valor are true. Dead bodies are heavy, and it's better not to touch them. Fear is paralysis. But it is better to be afraid than to move out to die, all limbs functioning and heart thumping and charging, and having your chest torn open for all the work. You have to pick the times not to be afraid. But when you are afraid, you must hide it, to save respect and reputation. You learned that the old men had lives of their own, and that they valued them, at least enough to try not to lose them. Anyone can die in a war if he tries. I'm 43 years old, and I'm still telling war stories. My daughter, Kathleen, tells me it's an obsession, that I should write about a little girl who finds $1 million and spends it all on a Shetland pony. In a way, I guess she's right. I should forget it. But the thing about remembering is that you don't forget. You take your material where you find it, which is in your life, at the intersection of past and present. The memory traffic feeds into a rotary up in your head, where it goes in circles for a while. Then pretty soon imagination feeds in, and the traffic merges and shoots off down 1,000 different streets. And as a writer, all you can do is pick a street and go for the ride, putting things down as they come at you. That's the real obsession. All those stories. I'm 43 years old, and the war occurred half a lifetime ago, and yet the remembering makes it now. And sometimes, remembering will lead to a story, which makes it forever. That's what stories are for. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. Many years after the war, Jimmy Cross came to visit me at my home in Massachusetts, and for a full day we drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and talked about everything we'd seen and done so long ago, all the things we still carried through our lives. Spread out across the kitchen table were maybe 100 old photographs. There were pictures of Rat Kiley and Kiowa and Mitchell Sanders, all of us, the faces incredibly soft and young. At one point, I remember, we paused over a snapshot of Ted Lavender, and after a while, Jimmy rubbed his eyes and said he'd never forgiven himself for Lavender's death. It was something that would never go away, he said quietly, and I nodded and told him I felt the same about certain things. Then, for a long time, neither of us could think of much to say. The thing to do, we decided, was to forget the coffee and switch to gin, which improved the mood. And not much later, we were laughing about some of the craziness that used to go on. The way Henry Dobbins carried his girlfriend's pantyhose around his neck like a comforter. Kaya was moccasins and hunting hatchet. Rat Kiley's comic books. By midnight, we were both a little high.
Whoa. Yeah? Okay, one more. You ready?
Yeah.
One more, please. This beats writing, doesn't it? The idea of this one is to rub the quarter into the elbow. So it stays inside in the bone of the elbow. All right? You rub it really hard, and in she goes. And then you get it out. It's in the... Look. There it is.
Jesus.
I almost blew it, sorry.
Did you practice a lot? I mean, is that...
I haven't practiced enough, obviously, with that one, but I do my best. No, that's a little kid. It's a little bit like writing, you know, the sense of you know, trying to make something happen out of nothing. You know?
Well, any artistic thing. I mean, like drawing a picture is making somebody think they see something that's not there. You know, that you make somebody think they're looking at a nose, but they're looking at a couple of lines.
Yeah.
It's not.
And the sense of illusion,
Yeah.
too. You know,
Yeah.
It's like making miracles happen, and the story can.
One of the things that Tim and I share is that very early in the stages of trying to become writers, I had taken out and typed out pages from Steinbeck. He had taken out and typed out pages from Hemingway and Faulkner, and we had both gone through stages of pretending to be those people. It's very much like a painter who's learning how to paint will go in a gallery and set up the easel and copy The Death of the Matador exactly. You know, what he's doing is learning how to paint. He's teaching himself how to paint. And I think that whole imitative process is really a writer with gifts able to see instinctively how sentences are built, actually copying the built sentences of the great writers to get a sense of the architectural nature of it.
I'm not a great talker, and I think that's why I'm a writer, is that I don't trust first, you know, as you can tell right now, I don't trust those first syllables to come out of my mouth. I love to study language. I love to look at possibilities, combinations, and recombinations. It's a kind of play, and it may strike others as being pretentious and, you know, so on. But for me, it's not. It's a kind of play. It's like golf or chess or lifting weights. I get pleasure out of it, and I hope that the pleasure is directed in the right way. That is, to try to transfer the pleasure from my own heart to the reader's heart. They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear. Often, they carried each other, the wounded or weak. They carried infections. They carried chess sets, basketballs, Vietnamese English dictionaries, insignia of rank, bronze stars and purple hearts, plastic cards imprinted with the code of conduct. They carried diseases, among them malaria and dysentery. They carried lice and ringworm and leeches and paddy algae and various rots and molds. They carried the land itself, Vietnam, the place, the soil, a powdery orange-red dust that covered their boots and fatigues and faces. They carried the sky, the whole atmosphere. They carried it, the humidity, the monsoons, the stink of fungus and decay, all of it. They carried gravity. They would often discard things along the route of march. Purely for comfort, they would throw away rations, blow their claymores and grenades, no matter, because by nightfall the resupply choppers would arrive with more of the same, then a day or two later still more. Fresh watermelons and crates of ammunition and sunglasses and woolen sweaters. The resources were stunning. Sparklers for the 4th of July, colored eggs for Easter. It was the great American war chest, the fruits of science, the smokestacks, the canneries, the arsenals at Hartford, the Minnesota forests, the machine shops, the vast fields of corn and wheat. They carried like freight trains. They carried it on their backs and shoulders, and for all the ambiguities of Vietnam, all the mysteries and unknowns, there was at least the single abiding certainty that they would never be at a loss for things to carry.
It was probably the central event in our lives. Consequently, it becomes an obsessive sort of subject. I can't remember, I think it was Hemingway who had said something to the effect of that every writer has to have suffered some wound, not necessarily, obviously, physically, but psychically. And a lot of writers, of course, they may suffer wounds in their childhood or some other disaster of ordinary life may strike them. But I think for people like Tim and I that the wound, the disaster, if you will, was the war.
The town called itself Turkey Capital of the World. In September, the governor and some congressmen came to town. People shut down their businesses and came in from their farms. Together, we watched trombones and crepe paper floats move on a blitzkrieg down Main Street. Turkey Day climaxed when the farmers herded a billion strutting, stinking, beady-eyed birds down the center of town, past the old Gobbler Cafe, past Woolworths and the Ben Franklin store, and the Standard Oil service station. Feathers and droppings and popcorn mixed together in tribute to the town and prairie. We were young. We stood on the curb and blasted the animals with ammunition from our pea shooters.
The small town Minnesota kind of Midwest life was great as a kid. You know, you play baseball and there's no crime and there are no drugs to speak of, at least when I was a kid. It was a kind of basic, down-to-earth, bread-and-butter, conservative town. On the left, as we pass here, is the Campbell Soup Factory. Campbell Soup in America is, is an institution that almost represents Middle America. Have you had your soup today? As their advertising slogan. And here's where the chicken soup for America is made. My sister worked here as a deboner. That is, she'd take the meat off the bones for 8 hours a day. She lasted a week. There's a kind of straight-laced, down the middle of the road sense of following the normal conventions of moral rectitude, where the law is passed, you obey the law. If it says one way on the street, you're going to go one way, and if it says go to war, the law, then one goes to war. A war was going on in the 1960s when I grew up, and this town was just as it is now, sound asleep, knowing next to nothing about even the location of Vietnam, much less all the political ambiguities and complexities of that war. If you were a kid growing up in this town and you were drafted to march off to Vietnam or to board a bus and to join the army, one was expected to do it without giving the matter a second thought. I spent the summer of 1968 working in an armor meatpacking plant in my hometown of Worthington, Minnesota. The plant specialized in pork products, and for 8 hours a day I stood on a quarter-mile assembly line, more properly a disassembly line, removing blood clots from the necks of dead pigs. My job title, I believe, was declotter. After slaughter, the hogs were decapitated, split down the length of the belly, pried open, eviscerated, and strung up by the hind hocks on a high conveyor belt. Then gravity took over. By the time a carcass reached my spot on the line, the fluids had mostly drained out, everything except for thick clots of blood in the neck and upper chest cavity. To remove the stuff, I used a kind of water gun. Goggles were a necessity, and a rubber apron. But even so, it was like standing for 8 hours a day under a lukewarm blood shower. At night, I'd go home smelling of pig. It wouldn't go away. Even after a hot bath, scrubbing hard, the stink was always there, like old bacon or sausage, a dense, greasy pig stink that soaked deep into my skin and hair. Among other things, I remember it was tough getting dates that summer. I felt isolated. I spent a lot of time alone. And there was also that draft notice tucked away in my wallet. Most of this I've told before, or at least hinted at. But what I have never told is the full truth. How I cracked. How at work one morning, standing on the pig line, I felt something break open in my chest. I don't know what it was. I'll never know. But it was real, I know that much. It was a physical rupture, a cracking, leaking, popping feeling. I remember dropping my water gun. Quickly, almost without thought, I took off my apron and walked out of the plant and drove home. I remember taking a hot shower. I remember packing a suitcase and carrying it out to the kitchen, standing very still for a few minutes, looking carefully at the familiar objects all around me. My house, I thought, my life. I'm not sure how long I stood there, but later I scribbled out a short note to my parents. What it said exactly, I don't recall now. Something vague. Taking off, will call. Love, Tim. I drove north.
Drop your silver in my tambourine.
That's great, thank you. I'm a storyteller. If I were to tell you the literal truth of what had happened to me, Tim O'Brien, in the summer of 1968, the summer I was drafted, I would tell you things like, well, I played golf. I worried a lot about the war and having to go to it. What should I do? But that literal truth would not get at a deeper kind of emotional truth, one I can't tell you. And so I make up a story to give you access to what was happening in my heart and in my head in the summer of 1968. And I invent things. I invent, well, I worked in a meatpacking plant and had hog blood all around me. And that hog blood, though it's invented and stuck into the story, it's invented for a purpose, to give a sense of the slaughter that was happening in my dreams and in my imagination as I pictured myself at war, in a war I detested. I make up an incident about running away from my hometown, heading for the Canadian border, right up against the edge of desertion, or draft dodging. I never did it, but I sure imagined it.
I never read anything by Tim O'Brien that wasn't true. I don't think that one can say that facts and truth are the same thing. what I read in the work, there is nothing in the work that strikes me as false in terms of my own experience of warfare or my own experience of the writing process.
Most often you do need to invent or imagine an event or a sequence or series of events to adequately present what it felt like to be somewhere, or what it, how it struck you. If you just were to recite the facts of something without any artistic ordering of it, any attempt to mine the meaning out of it, you would have reportage. But since there was so much reportage, both on film and on television and in books and newspapers about the Vietnam War, why bother?
To understand what happens to the GI among the minefields of My Lai, you must know something about what happens in America. You must understand Fort Lewis, Washington. You must understand a thing called basic training. A college graduate in May 1968, I was at Fort Lewis in mid-August. 100 of us came. We watched one another's hair fall. We learned the word sir. I made a friend, Eric, and together he and I stumbled like galley slaves through the first months of basic training.
Fear, in a word. Depriving you of your peace of mind, of your routine, of your physical comforts, depriving you of everything, keeping you totally off guard so you never know what's happening next, why it's happening, and always with the threat of physical punishment, not in the sense of maybe corporal punishment, but certainly having to run more, suffer more, not getting food, and the only way to survive is to lay low.
They were tough. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. Grief, terror, love, longing. These were intangibles, but the intangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run, or freeze, or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance and perfect posture. They carried their reputations. They carried the soldier's greatest fear, which was the fear of blushing. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive. No dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They died so as not to die of embarrassment. Each morning, despite the unknowns, they made their legs move. They endured. They did not submit to the obvious alternative, which was simply to close the eyes and fall. So easy, really. Go limp and tumble to the ground and let the muscles unwind, and not speak and not budge until your buddies picked you up and lifted you into the chopper that would roar and dip its nose and carry you off to the world. A mere matter of falling, yet no one ever fell. It was not courage exactly. The object was not valor. Rather, they were too frightened to be cowards.
I think it still remains the dirty little secret of most people who've been in battle, that there is a dark fascination and attraction to it. I have never read any good literature about war that denies that particular truth. With all of that adrenaline pounding through your system, your perceptions seem to attain this terrible but attractive clarity. And then there is the confrontation with the ultimate, death. And so you are drawn to this experience. You're drawn to it afterward. That's why I wrote in A Rumor of War how I had that nostalgia almost for Vietnam, because all of a sudden ordinary life seemed to be such an awful lot of pettiness.
For all its horror, you can't help but gape at the awful majesty of combat. You stare out at tracer rounds unwinding through the dark like brilliant red ribbons. You crouch in ambush as a cool, impassive moon rises over the nighttime paddies. You admire the fluid symmetries of troops on the move, the harmonies of sound and shape and proportion, the great sheets of metal fire streaming down from a gunship, the illumination rounds, the white phosphorus, the purply-orange glow of napalm, the rocket's red glare. It's not pretty exactly. It's astonishing. It fills the eye. It commands you. You hate it, yes, but your eyes do not. Like a killer forest fire, like cancer under a microscope, any battle or bombing raid or artillery barrage has the aesthetic purity of absolute moral indifference, a powerful, implacable beauty. And a true war story will tell the truth about this, though the truth is ugly. A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. You can tell a true war story if it embarrasses you. If you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war. They come home talking dirty.
The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The Colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. I am tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. Something for your poetry, no? He said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
The things they didn't know. Not knowing the language, they did not know the people. They did not know what the people loved or respected or feared or hated. They did not recognize hostility unless it was patent, unless it came in a form other than language. The complexities of tone and tongue were beyond them. Dinkies, Stink Harris called it, monkey chatter, bird talk. Not knowing the language, the men did not know whom to trust. Trust was lethal. They did not know false smiles from true smiles, or if in Quang Ngai a smile had the same meaning it had in the States. Maybe the dinks got things mixed up, Eddie once said. Maybe the gooks cry when they're happy and smile when they're sad. Who the hell knows? I mean, hey, this here's a different culture.
Seems like everything I see reflects the love that used to be. In you I put all my faith and trust. Right before my eyes, my world has turned to dust. I hear all the night.
In Vietnam, we had ways of making the dead seem not quite so dead. By slighting death, by acting, we pretended it was not the terrible thing it was. By our language, which was both hard and wistful, we transformed the bodies into piles of waste. Thus, when someone got killed, as Kurt Lemon did, his body was not really a body, but rather one small bit of waste in the midst of a much wider wastage. I learned that words make a difference. If it isn't human, it doesn't matter much if it's dead. And so a VC nurse, fried by napalm, was a crispy critter. A Vietnamese baby, which lay nearby, was a roasted peanut. Just a crunchy munchy, Rat Kiley said, as he stepped over the body.
Well, war is a unique and an alien experience to most people. Unlike, say, the experience of love, of marriage, of going to work every day, raising children, the stuff, if you will, of the literature of ordinary life, the kind of thing, let's say, that John Updike writes about. When you set out to write about war, you are aware that you are communicating to an audience that in some ways is from another planet. And you have to get this experience across in such a way that they live it. The heat of the jungle, the mud sucking at their boots, and the taste of old copper pennies in your mouth when you're under fire. And the sheer terror of not knowing when something is going to strike out at you.
They hang from trees, they nestle in shrubbery, they lie under the sand. They haunted us. Chip, my black buddy from Orlando, straight into a hedgerow and triggered a rigged 105 artillery round. He died in such a way that for once you could never know his color. He was wrapped in a plastic body bag. We popped smoke, and a helicopter took him away, my friend. Nobody said much. The whole platoon stood there watching, feeling all kinds of things, but there wasn't a great deal of pity for the baby water buffalo. Kurt Lemon was dead. Rat Kiley had lost his best friend in the world. He shot off the tail. He shot away chunks of meat below the ribs. All around us there was the smell of smoke and filth and deep greenery, and the evening was humid and very hot. Rat went to automatic. He shot randomly, almost casually, quick little spurts in the belly and butt. Then he reloaded, squatted down, and shot it in the left front knee. Again the animal fell hard and tried to get up, but this time it couldn't quite make it. It wobbled and went down sideways. Rat shot it in the nose. He bent forward and whispered something, as if talking to a pet. Then he shot it in the throat. All the while, the baby buffalo was silent, or almost silent, just a light bubbling sound where the nose had been. It lay very still. Nothing moved except the eyes, which were enormous. The pupils, shiny black and dumb. Rat Kiley was crying. He tried to say something, but then cradled his rifle and went off by himself. The rest of us stood in a ragged circle around the baby buffalo. For a time, no one spoke. We had witnessed something essential, something brand new and profound, a piece of the world so startling there was not yet a name for it. I keep writing about war because it's the material that life has given me. It's like asking Joseph Conrad, hey, Joe, stop writing all these sea stories. Enough of this typhoon, youth, Lord Jim stuff. Give us a good land story somewhere in Kansas. Conrad wasn't writing sea stories. And I'm not writing war stories. He was writing stories that were set aboard sea vessels, and those vessels served as a crucible. Similarly, I'm not writing about war. They aren't literally war stories. They're stories about men at war. Ultimately, what each of these stories is about is the human heart under intense pressure. In the mountains that day, I watched Lemon turn sideways. He laughed and said something to Rat Kiley. Then he took a peculiar half step, moving from shade into bright sunlight, and the booby-trapped 105 round blew him into a tree. The parts were just hanging there, so Dave Jensen and I were ordered to shinny up and peel him off. I remember the white bone of an arm. I remember pieces of skin and something wet and yellow that must have been the intestines. The gore was horrible and stays with me. But what wakes me up 20 years later is Dave Jensen singing Lemon Tree as we threw down the parts. As a writer, my daily routine has to do with going over and over and over particular events, searching for that precisely and exactly right way of rendering that event. When one's lifting weights, it hurts, and yet you feel a kind of blood and gorging thing happening in your biceps that is pleasurable even though you're straining. And that same kind of feel is there when I'm working on a particularly entrenching passage where the prose just won't do the sorts of things I want it to do. Let me just try to show you here what I mean. 20 years later, I can still see the sunlight on Kurt Lemon's face. I can see him turning, looking back at Rat Kiley. Then he laughed and took that curious half step from shade into sunlight, his face suddenly brown and shining. And when his foot touched down, in that instant, he must have thought it was the sunlight that was killing him. It was not the sunlight. It was a rigged 105 round. But. At the word but, I was stopped in the middle of this story, and I typed in something like, but from my angle of vision, he seemed to. And I paused there and I thought, this is a story about storytelling. And it's a story that refers to storytelling throughout the course of it, you know, how to tell a true war story. And I thought, why not be direct about this and be straight with the reader and be honest and tell what to me is a kind of ultimate truth, which is that for myself as a writer, and I think for virtually any writer of fiction, there's that constant, unending search for rightness. And so I simply deleted what I'd just written, canceled it out, and I typed in, but if I could ever get the story right, how the sun seemed to gather around him and pick him up and lift him high into a tree, if I could somehow recreate the fatal whiteness of that light, the quick glare, the obvious cause and effect, then you would believe the last thing Kurt Lemon believed, which for him must have been the final truth. It was the sunlight that was killing him.
The first time he alludes to it, I believe, is when he talks about the same man, pieces of him hanging from the tree. And then he begins with that. Later he tells us what happens. He keeps returning to it and he can't get it right. He displays that in the book, he tells us. And then he also talks about his own sorrow and frustration at not being able to do that. But it's an important sorrow and frustration to acknowledge and to admit, because then you're telling the reader, this is the story as I'm making it. This is not the war. The war was something else. And this is what the war did to my memory. This is where the war is in the human imagination now, which is the only place it can be. Just as much as there are still, probably still craters in Vietnam or defoliated areas, there's a part of the imagination that's always going to be cratered, always going to be defoliated. And you're never going to find the words that are going to be able to create this in another human being, as much as that is what you would like to do. It's not, because what you're creating is the language of the imagination's debris and the truth of the imagination, not the war.
After my friend Chip had died 20 years ago, I remember myself feeling a sense of incredible sorrow and sadness because he was a close friend.
But I also remember imagining his death. Over and over, imagining how did Chip's face look in the instant that his foot hit that mine. What was he thinking about? What was his last thought as he soared into that bush? Well, now, 20 years later, as a writer, I'm able, through the magic of storytelling and the magic of fiction, to invent a kind of reality, to make those fantasies I had 20 years ago come true and come real. And so I have Chip stand in, this fellow named Kurt Lemon, think to himself, it's the sunlight that's killing me. He steps from the shade into sunlight, he hits the mine, boom, into a tree. A flash of sunlight, and he's into that tree. Who knows what Chip really thought? No one will ever know. But it's a way of, I think, of giving access to the reader to something that, to me, is of critical emotional importance. One's last thought as one flies into a tree. Although it's all invented, the detail, it comes from as it has to for every writer about any subject. It comes from my heart and from my life, from what there is of my spirit. I don't want to beat the Vietnam bush on this either. I think that these moments, these memories, we all have them in our lives. A father dying 20 years ago, a first love 20 years ago. And those few images that remain after all those years having gone by, we play with those images. We rearrange them. We color them. We change them so as to arrive in the end at a kind of perfect imagined memory.